The Diary of Dr. X, episode 29. Becoming the Research 2 on Vanity and the Kindness of Strangers. I'm not sure when exactly I began to think of us instead of them in the study of the street culture in the Osborne village, but it most definitely happened. In hindsight, I crossed that line quite some time ago. It was around the time I finished that last round of teaching university I spoke about in Money Talks, Honesty Walks that I first noticed it. You see, when the teaching was done and the last paycheck was spent, I lapsed back into my more comfortable street persona immediately and discovered I was back home as Dr. X. It was also then that I realized just how stressful it had been to put on that other doctor's hat for 4 months as its weight lifted off of me, probably for the last time. A few months later, one of my street friends put a name to that transition. You've met Mandy before, I think. In the fall of 2012, Mandy, Zuki, and I all met at the All Saints Anglican Church at Broadway in Osborne, a couple blocks north of the Assiniboine River. All Saints also runs a soup kitchen, much like Augustine United in the village itself, but a food bank as well. That's why I was there on that occasion. We'd all been in for free coffees and our numbers on the waiting list that day before we met at one of the picnic tables outside. We sat and chatted about the best places to find butts as the golden leaves leisurely drifted down that day from the surrounding trees. Beautiful fall day. Broadway at lunchtime in summer, Zuki said, trying to trump the last best place to find butts. Oh yeah, I said, nothing could top that, but you have to be gathering them up while people are still out smoking them and having their lunch in the street. Can't be shy or someone else will come and get them first. Yeah, Mandy said, it's amazing how fast you lose your vanity, isn't it? And there she nailed it. Nailed the transition between the straight people and the street people like me, in terms of their psychological attitude. I realized just as she said it that I had been working on that transition all summer. When I first started observing the street culture in the Osborne village, you see, I had treated it as a short-term thing, something that would pass when I got a full-time teaching position, and then myself and my students could have a laugh about in my lectures. I had also begun with a focus on collecting butts when I was short on tobacco between teaching jobs. In the beginning, I was very timid. I worked downtown rather than my own neighborhood for butts, and even then wouldn't pick them up if someone watched. As the teaching dried up and I drifted to other jobs on and off, I began to collect cans around my own neighborhood between jobs and still avoided being seen scavenging the front streets, especially avoided picking cans up in front of pretty young women. That's long gone by this point, though, just as Mandy suggested. Why? Because I've come to realize what all street people do at some point, and especially the panhandlers, that your reputation as a loser in a charity case is worth money. So hiding it is counterproductive. You come to want people to know about it, and even make a point of deliberately displaying it in situations where you think you may benefit from it. As for myself, as I've said, I don't ask for charity, but I do receive it regularly. People also give me stuff on a more regular basis now that I no longer hide who I am or what I am doing. Smokers are probably the best. Most understand what it's like to be without and jonesing for a hoot of old Nick. Often you will have more than one person hand you a smoke or two if you pull up to one of the ashtrays in front of a club on the strip at prime time here in the village and start emptying it of butts. Just as I suggested about Broadway at lunchtime earlier. Happens there too. My best score ever of tobacco products brought in about $200, believe it or not. I was scoping out the CCCP Groceries parking lot for butts and quarters and such when one of their employees got out of a car. "I've been saving this specifically for you," she said. "A friend of mine's father just died and she had no one to give this to." She opened the back door of her car and withdrew 2 large black plastic garbage bags. "This one," she said, as she smoked a king-size cigarette which bounced between her lips as she spoke, "is tobacco. I don't smoke rollies." She then raised the other hand with the other bag. "This one is filter tubes." Hell, I smoked for about 3 weeks on that score. You sometimes get food or weed or drinks also, though not as often. I could tell you half a dozen stories about each if I had the time. And maybe I'll fill in a little bit here in the book version of this. Much more common is my preferred form of currency, beer cans. I've been handed $3 to $5 bags out of people's trunks several times, or a dozen or 2 bottles. Just as common is people seeing you scavenging and telling you they will run up to their suite and bring you some down in this neighborhood. One fellow even brought me a $2 tip for taking them in for me. That was right by the Osborne Street Bridge, corner of Roslyn Road, the old building there. My biggest score ever for cans was Canada Day 2012. The village throws a big party that day, you see. The streets along the strip are closed, with booths and food vendors being set up all along the street selling this and that, and the clubs and restaurants all expanding their patios into the street as well. I searched the alley behind Osborne that day when the manager of the Australian pub on the west side of the street noticed me. She had 2 very large garbage bags in her hands. They were difficult to carry for a woman her size. She wasn't very big. "You want these?" she asked. "They're all beer cans." "Sure," I said. "My contribution for the day," she replied with a giggle. I dragged and carried them home, heavy even for me, and had a nice binge for a few days. What with the cans I found on the way to and from the vendor, and while searching for butts during that time. Best of all, though, is money. Just today, I was coming up the alley across the street from Osborne, checking the bins as usual. When I crossed the street, I heard a woman's voice say, "Excuse me." It was windy today, so it was difficult to locate where the voice was coming from. I looked about at the apartment windows on each side of the street, trying to see if I could find someone yelling out at me. And then she spoke again. "Excuse me, sir." I looked over my shoulder and finally located her. She had clearly followed me down the street a ways and already had her wallet open in her hands, so when she said, "Would you like some money?" it was no surprise. "Of course, I do accept charity," I replied. She pulled out a $20 bill and passed it to me. Before I thanked her, and we parted ways. That paid for my beer and a pack of cigarettes. Along with the empties I already had at home and collected along the way as I returned with my smokes and beers. That wasn't the best drop I ever received, though. That's what the panhandlers call receiving money, getting a drop. The best one was last spring, early enough that I was still wearing my old beat-up winter boots. I walked past the northwest corner of River and Osborne that day when I saw a fellow give the native guy in the wheelchair who often works that corner in front of the Liquor Commission a drop. They visited briefly, so he was probably a regular patron. He followed me as I went to check the newspaper boxes across the alley for money. I guess he saw me doing that and approached me. "You look like you need a new pair of boots," he said. "Would you accept some help?" "Sure," I replied. And he reached into his wallet and pulled out $30. The usual thank you, and I was set for beer and smokes that day also. That's often the way it goes. You get your handouts as a scavenger when people see you checking phones and newspaper boxes for money, or people see you digging through the bins or picking through the ashtrays. Eventually you learn not to hide it, just as I have. It took me a while, but I eventually got there. The pepper spray incident helped, as I hazard a guess that had those thugs seen me digging through the dumpsters, they probably wouldn't have tried to rob me, right? On more than one occasion, I have also seen others get a stripe from a shopping cart with a quarter in it, or a phone or a newspaper box I didn't check because they were watching, and I was timid, and they cleaned it out because I hadn't before I could get there. So the competition provides a further reason. Nowadays, I'm calculating whether I can reach the potential score before the person coming in that direction, rather than trying to hide what I do. Shortly after my last bit of teaching in particular, I began training myself not to care if someone was watching, and the payoffs increased immediately. You see, I had used some of the early episodes of Dr. X in my lectures by that point and explained my research to my students. I had even ended one of the classes by saying, "So if you see me trolling the streets of the Osborne village for beer cans and cigarette butts, say hello to Dr. X." It was then that the last of my inhibitions had basically melted away. And that is exactly the point where you become one of the street people. It's not about identifying with the role so much as truly accepting it through your behavior, in my experience. It is the point where you realize that the charity you may potentially receive from your reputation as a loser is far more important to you over the short term than your self-respect is. You no longer give a shit about your low social reputation. In fact, you learn to use it to your benefit and accept it. I can only describe this as a process of psychological self-defense. You see, by accepting your shitty life, when you wake up in the morning the next day and it is still just as shitty as it was the day before, you won't be disappointed if you have lost any hope of ever having anything better. Now, will you? No. You just come to expect that it won't get any better, and there is nothing you can do that can improve your situation in any way. And this is exactly what the CCCP psychopaths, in their wisdom, those who run the central banks and set fiscal policy, are subjecting a large minority of their populations to by deliberately maintaining high rates of unemployment in order to keep downward pressure on wages. Why? Because what these policies imply, I'm here to inform you, is that a significant percentage of the unemployed population are not just between jobs, but chronically or permanently unemployed, if not homeless. Those at the bottom of the desirability list concerning hiring, for whatever reason, are just fucked. But as explained in the previous episode, both human and ecological welfare are, well, irrelevant from an economic perspective. So why would one expect a dominant economic philosophy to promote the welfare of actual persons over fictitious corporate ones? The simple answer is, you wouldn't. Cheers.